Normally, I would regard mathemes as off-limit for conference presentations. Too much background is required, and there are too many ways to interpret each sign. But in the case of Lacan's matheme for metaphor, there is something worth pointing out. We have two expressions on the left of the equal sign, a kind of before situation prior to the after of metaphor as a proper form on the right. There is a crisscross negation that allows metaphor to join with a certain unknown something that was seeming to lie beneath the signifying chain, the X. No one could say what it was, but it gave the chain its structure and function. In this sense, the X was the boundary of the chain, the front and the end, so to speak, what forced the chain to curl in on itself and complete a circle, the effect of the récit fort that Dan Collins cites as the organizing principle of art. X is thus like the horizon. The signifying chain is like the marks made on the Euclidean representational plane. The X can be both the horizon and the point on the horizon where lines running parallel on the representational plane will actually converge. With the X being a prior real, an R1 so to speak, and with metaphor being a kind of end effect, also resistant to the symbolic, and thus an R2, or second kind of real, we see how the formation of metaphor fits into Lacan's basic model of the syntax of the ordinary sentence. Where X works at the meager level of a defect, like the shadow of the pigeon, it can parallel the flight through a series of vicissitudes that are invented or projected, literally, if we take the shadow as an example. When we are forced to admit their reunion at the point of R2, the sheer experience of astonishment, we must place both paths on the same plane. Eros requires that Daphne have no escape route. Her eros and ero must be on the same level as Apollo's, giving her no option but to metaphorize, that is, she must become a laurel tree. It's not the laurel tree per se that is in question here. It's the way that defects, little x's, can work within the signifying chain to result into a kind of lipogram effect, such as that created by Georges Perec when he wrote a novel entirely without using the letter E. The creation of the literary void is not that different from the creation of the architectural void. A rip or tear in space becomes the anomaly that easily morphs into the gates of hell. Anything requiring us to deviate our otherwise straight path, making us fly along the surfaces of buildings below, so to speak, creates this effect, and the effect is that there is no escaping the final crossing of the two orders of time. The two types of pigeon flight, the airborne bird and its shadow, are like the two signifying chains in Lacan's matheme for the metaphor. At the point of convergence, they cancel each other out. We are left with metaphor to return via Eros's nonstop flight directly back to R1, the first real, to the simple issue of defect, which is nothing more than the split, the distinction. This may sound a bit Hegelian, but the split is simultaneously a distinction and an indication that is the efficient cause of the symbolic chain, what gets the chain moving. It works because it is not allowed to be a part of the chain except through a continuing series of faults, gaps, slips, and falls. We can think of X as both the shadow and the surfaces that the shadow is forced to climb and scuttle across. At this point, we can garner some insights into a kind of energetics explanation of Lacan's system of imaginary, symbolic, and real. Our claim of authenticity comes from the fact that it is myth itself that has provided the key information. Without the backstory about Apollo's argument with Eros and the construction of the double-tipped arrow by which Eros wounds Apollo with love and Daphne with hate, we wouldn't be able to see how the double structure allows the signifying chain, representing a pursuer and pursued, and more generically, the paired entities of demon and ascesis, or retreat, to carry along an element that, by being non-representable, and thus present only through breaks and defects in the signifying chain, is none the less effective. If the Apollo line looks straight, it's not. In terms of an actual and effective energy that in its circulation runs the whole show of signifying chains, the retroactive connection of R2 with R1 is the flight of Eros's arrow that we can associate with a position of truth in Lacan's discourse schema. Truth is about the return of something, a message, a truth in reverse order. This palindromic condition is appropriate to what Lacan called the truth of truth, suggesting that there is a truth of the primary Euclidean virtuality of the senses, and another truth that constitutes another virtuality, a virtuality of the two versions or sides of the real. The first real is suppressed, or in the case of certain traumas, unnoticed. It is associated with the autoerotic state of the pre-subject, before the mirror stage. Residual bits of R1 scatter through the signifying chain and create traps, embarrassments, raw emotional flashbacks. By the time we reach the end of the sentence, we are supposed to know what the first part meant, but what does this mean for either ordinary experience or psychoanalysis? My theory is that R2 is like the epiphanies of James Joyce, bits of nothing that constitute a trope, a primal moment. The connection to R2 to metaphor has a lot of promise. It means that we are in the position to restructure signifiers, to see the world from a new viewpoint. But where is this viewpoint? Its position would seem to be both outside and inside the observed world. It is like the position of the audience in an auditorium within a complex of overlapping reference fields. Just as the Apollo-Daphne story arches backward from the point of Daphne's transformation to the realization of the meaning of their original antipathy, and just as that backstory involves Apollo's insult to Eros and Eros's revenge, we really don't know what's been happening. We don't understand the structure of that surface that Lacan calls architecture and identifies with the self-intersecting surface, like the forms of projective geometry we know as the Mobius band, cross-cap, and Kleinbottle. Thus, we can't imagine, without this reference to architecture, why Lacan would involve questions of ethics with projective geometry. As soon as we have a kind of Rosetta Stone, our model of metaphor's relation to the two temporalities of the sentence, we can make the necessary transition to other kinds of actual architectures where the same temporalities overlap. If we can make the transition, we can focus on specifics, such as the point where R2 arrives back at the place of R1. Then we can say, with the metaphor model, that the enigmatic metaphor has discovered the pile of trash that was able to generate the clear profile. We have traveled along the meridian to find the truth of truth, a simple split or division that miniaturizes the relation of R1 to its externalized self, the public metaphor. The compression of R1 and R2 creates fractures, if we apply a purely mechanical analogy. And these fracture lines, which reduce the signifying chain to a kind of pile of debris, allow for the penetrating light of the meridian, or rather multiple meridians, or in other words, symbolic forms. The amazing thing is, of course, when there are exact references to this process from independent sources. This is where the image plays the role of M, the metaphor, to create astonishment by combining the two temporalities of the symbolic. Visual images force this combining, showing us an uncanny marriage of opposite ideas. René Magritte's Mémoire d'un Saint, thanks to its theatrical reference, reveals something true about all stages, which is the function of the fourth wall, an entirely conventional device by which the audience can imagine themselves present within the fictional setting, without themselves being visible to any of the actors or taking up any space amidst the other parts of the set. The sky indicates that the actors must imagine that they see all around their fictional world, which we know to be actually enclosed by the signal of fiction and voluntary suspension of disbelief, the curtain. The contronymic virtuality of R1, one half of the curtain, is required for R2, the effect of astonishment that takes place when the curtain closes. More than one artist has had the idea of painting a set of curtains while inside the frame of a painting, itself a set of curtains. Sometimes, like Picasso with his Demoiselles d'Avignon, we get additional information about this interior enclosed by fictional clouds, or rather clouds that resist being taken fully within the symbolic, if only because they remain as a virtuality, and hence invisible within the symbolic. We see here references to bimodality. We have two guardians, two literal representatives of R1 and R2. Also in mask is the easily recognizable figure of melancholy, seated with chin on hand and arm on knee. Is the bowl of fruit from the anecdote about Zeuxis and Parrhasius? Parrhasius's name is so close to parrhesia, the ability to tell the whole truth, the full 360 degrees of the truth, so to speak. Parrhasius did this by painting a curtain to fool the judges, who believed that the fiction of trompe-l'oeil was as close as they could get to the real. Artists such as Picasso and Magritte continue Parrhasius's parestical argument by showing us the inside and the outside at the same time, a signature both of the uncanny and projective geometry, which is unfortunately beyond the scope of this presentation.